And good morning, everyone. We're back. And as promised, on line one is the man, the one and only Scott Braddock, the editor of thequorumreport.com. Good morning, Scott. How are you?
Good morning, Dave. I'm doing fantastic. Well, hello to everybody in West Texas.
Well, I'm sure glad you called because, man, I have a question for you. And I know I'm just saying that you're the guy that's plugged into what's happening down in that legislature down there in Austin. Mm-hmm. Listen, we did the story here in Lubbock a few days ago about them sunsetting the licensing bureau for plumbers. I have been astounded at the response that we have gotten on that, and surprised that so many people are so concerned about this. It wound up on the front page of the local paper. We've had just countless number of texts regarding this. So fill us in. What is the legislature thinking, and what is the governor going to do about the fear that we are going to have no licensed plumbers in the state of Texas?
Well, it's a huge safety issue. I mean, it is a legitimate, a lot of times you hear about sort of manufactured crises happening here and there, but when it comes to plumbers, you're talking about not only the people who deal with sewage and drinking water, but also the people who make sure that connections for natural gas are done correctly. I mean, this is a real safety issue, right? So you have the governor's office right now trying to figure out exactly how to extend the agency that oversees plumbers and licenses them. And the governor has said that he is going to go ahead and do that unilaterally, that he can do that himself. Now, we don't know the legal gymnastics he's going to use to try to accomplish that, because as far as I understand it, and I've been talking to legislative veterans, all of these state agencies are under the jurisdiction, under the purview of the legislature. And so the original thinking on this was that after the legislation failed during the regular session to extend that agency, that there would have to be a special session of the legislature. And guys, it could be a 2-day thing. They could come in on a Saturday and Sunday and fix this. They only have to pass one bill that says the agency survives for the next 2 years, and then they could come back and do maybe some modernization efforts there.
Okay.
Look at that in the next legislative session. But the governor says he can do it on its own. We'll wait to see what the details are. He hasn't said what they are just yet.
Let me ask you this. What in the world was the legislature thinking by not taking this up? I mean, I don't know. Obviously, there's some issues with that department, and maybe they need to be resolved, but why in the world would they not extend that maybe for 1 year or 2 years?
Well, as the legislation is laid out, the agencies, and by the way, it used to be, because there were some questions about the way this happened with the dental board years ago, it was sunsetted as well. Maybe we should back up and explain how this works. The agencies in Texas are periodically reviewed by a commission and then, reauthorized by the legislature to make sure that those agencies are, number one, running efficiently, and number two, that they're even still necessary. There have been some agencies that went away. It's a good government thing, making sure that these things are running as they're supposed to. And they were up for review this year at the plumbing board, and they were found to be not running efficiently. And we've talked about this on the show. One of the reasons that it takes so long to get a license in Texas, and it can take 8 months to a year to get a plumbing license in Texas at a time when there is a shortage of plumbers. That's thought to be unacceptable by a lot of folks. One of the reasons it takes so long is that if you live in Lubbock or Houston or Dallas or anywhere in our 254 counties of a state of 30 million people, the only place you can take your test to become a plumber is right here in Austin, where I'm sitting today. That seems to be unacceptable. And so the proposal was, and this was supported by the governor and supported by some Republicans and Democrats alike, what they were going to do is move the plumbing board over to the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation that has field offices around the state, and so people would be able to do tests in other places as well. And, not remove the safety aspect of this at all from it, but make it just a little bit easier for us to get some more plumbers, because we need some more of them. But that became contentious at the end of the legislative session. There were some who argued that it shouldn't be done immediately, and that change should maybe be done in 2 years instead of immediately, and everything broke down right at the end of the session. But for this agency to go away is definitely unacceptable. And when you hear from, and as I have heard from, leaders in construction who are generally against licensing of trades because they think that's a barrier to entry that's not fair, for roofers, for example, but roofers don't deal with the same kind of safety deals that safety aspects that plumbers do. And so those construction guys are like, look, even though we don't want licensing for all the other trades, we do want it for plumbing.
Well, now, Scott, I've talked to a lot of people about this, some that knew a lot about plumbing, some of them that didn't, and a lot of people believe that this licensing, like you said, could be a problem with opening the door to new plumbers. But a lot of the plumbers think that that's a good thing because, hey, the less plumbers there are, the more money I get if I get called out to plumb something. And so there's both sides to that. And the other thing that I've heard is that licensing doesn't necessarily mean specializations, that your specializations get done somewhere else. The licensing board doesn't give you those specializations, for example, for natural gas lines as well as like hospital lines and whatnot.
That's right. And, when you look at the safety aspect of this, that seems to be the most important thing. I will say that the unions were very opposed to the changes that were proposed because they, like you say, want to see more barriers to entry for people to be able to get into plumbing and therefore to be able to control the labor supply. I'm
just going to be honest with you. I kind of think it would be a great experiment, and I know that people don't like the thought of experimenting for the next 2 years with this, but at any point in time, you could always do a special session and fix the problem. But I think it'd be a great experiment to see what happens. I mean, some of these licensing boards, they tried to get rid of cosmetology before, and they weren't able to get it done. And this was almost, I'm assuming they just kind of ran out of time, but this may be a great experiment. I think they should leave it as is.
They did, although, with cosmetology, I would just say that you're not dealing with things that explode.
And understand that, but again, the licensing, the licensing doesn't give you the certificate or the specialization. That's done through other ways.
Sure, you still have to have the license before you can do the other stuff.
And you have to have the specializations to do this. Why can't you just get the specialization from, let's say, somewhere else, and before you could work on this or that?
Well, here's one of the points that was made by the Speaker of the House. He had said, look, and by the way, in this legislative session that was, pretty anti-local control, the Speaker had said, look, cities can handle this. They can do inspections, and that's true in places like Houston and Dallas, for example, probably in Lubbock as well. But we have so many people who live in places where it would just be the Wild West for no regulation whatsoever. Forget the licenses or specialization or anything else. In unincorporated Harris County, for example, where Houston is outside the city limits, at least about 2 million people live there, and a lot of them don't even commute into Houston. A lot of people work and live there, and so those places would be wide open for whatever to happen. So it could be a costly experiment, and I don't think it's one that the governor agrees with. It's interesting to see that the governor is stepping up and wanting to take action on this, unilateral or not, and we'll see what his legal justification is.
It worries me more that he would try to do this by himself than it does for them to leave it as is, because I think it would set a terrible precedent for Texas moving forward.
It's an interesting point, and we've been covering this at quorumreport.com. Whenever there is a crisis, and you gentlemen know this, whenever there's a quote-unquote crisis, that's usually when somebody will do what some folks consider a power grab and take the authority away from certain folks for themselves. And anytime you centralize power, that's a problem. Right now, folks are probably going to say, well, it's a plumbing board. It's not that big a deal for the governor to do it himself because it is a safety issue. And who wants to bother with a special session? Well, that argument works until there's a governor that you don't like. So let's say that we move down the road and there's a Democratic governor someday who wants to maybe, and this was something that was floated by someone else, not me, and I was thinking through the legal aspects of this. But let's say you have a Democratic governor one day who wants to say, you know what, HHSC should be able to, that's the Health and Human Services Department, they should be able to perform abortions over there. And someone will say, well, wait a minute, the governor can't just say the agency can do whatever. And then someone will point back and go, well, remember back in the summer of 2019 when you let the governor say whatever he wanted to about this agency over here? Or they're going to hold up that document and say, well, maybe he does actually have the authority to do whatever he wants.
Well, Scott, it seems to me that maybe too much is being made of this because we live in a country that there's always places to go when you have a problem like that. And if the governor oversteps and does something illegal, then the courts will come in and change it, will they not?
It's an interesting point. In the absence of court action, whatever happens. Whenever agencies will, for for example, propose different rules that we all have to live under as Texans, because most of the time when the legislature is not in session, it's the agencies that sort of run the state along with the governor's office. And if they make a rule change and the legislature doesn't challenge it and nobody challenges it in court, then it's what is allowed to stand.
And it becomes a precedent.
And because of precedent, right? So if so, in that example that I gave, if it was the case that the governor was allowed to go on and do this by himself with the plumbing board, it could later be that something else is done that people maybe don't agree with and is not considered a crisis, but that later governor could point back to past precedent and say, well, y'all let Governor Abbott do that. So if you want to stop me on this, you'll have to take me to court.
So let's jump over because we're running out of time. Now, I read this new poll that says that Beto O'Rourke should run for. They want Beto O'Rourke to run for Senate versus president, and I think honestly, the national Democrats would want that as well for just the chance that he could, I guess, get the base out to actually hopefully turn Texas purple at least. But does it even look like at all Beto O'Rourke would be running for Senate?
Legally he could do that. He could switch over and run for U.S. Senate, as we've talked about.
He would have to quit one and then start the other, though, right?
Yes, and this poll is very telling because if you think about who was asked the question, it's Democratic voters in Texas, which that would need to be his power base in his run for the White House, right? And as far as trying to secure the nomination in the Democratic Party. Democrats in Texas, 60%, and Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters saying that he ought to switch and stop running for the White House and run against Cornyn instead. Only 27% of Texas Democrats said that he should continue his run for the White House. So his support. I think the most telling thing here is that folks in his own backyard are not really supporting him continuing down this sort of what seems like a quixotic path right now.
Well, and the other thing that I noticed was out of all the different candidates that ran against Donald Trump, he was one of the worst.
Yeah, he was
in
one of
Texas,
the worst,
which is kind of sad.
And you saw in that same Quinnipiac poll that it was Joe Biden who it was within the margin of error, but 48 to 44, Biden was actually beating Trump in Texas.
I'm sorry, I don't believe that.
Which I don't believe that either. And of course, after 2016, we all know that all the polling was correct leading up to that election, right? So point being,
I always say it's light years until our election. It's 18 months away. There's a lot that's going to change between now and then.
That is exactly right, and we always have to remind ourselves that remember all the people who were the front runners at one point that never became president, like Rick Perry, Ben Carson, Michelle Bachmann, etc. There's a long way to go.
Yes.
Jeb Bush.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But now we are going to have to hurry up. But what's going on the Quorum Report right now?
Well, we are taking an in-depth look at some of the issues that we talked about with the plumbing board. We're unclogging that, as I told Chad the other day, for folks, and figuring out whatever else is going on with the Secretary of State's office. These emails came out just this week that show that maybe Governor Abbott knew firsthand what was going on with that voter purge that was so controversial earlier in the year, going in-depth on all this stuff, and more at quorumreport.com. You can always sign up for our free emails there at quorumreport.com.
All right, Scott, thank you for coming on. Scott Braddock, editor of the Quorum Report. We'll see you next week.
Talk soon. Thank you.
All right, thanks.